И мы снова в эфире. И последний наш
And
спикер
we are online again,
Christoph Rumpel,
and
который
our
расскажет
last
нам
speaker
про
for
исходный
today
код
is
Laravel и
Christopher
закроет его в этом
Rumpel, who will
файле. Привет,
talk to us
Christoph.
about the source code in Laravel and open some secrets for us. So, hi, Christoph.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Расскажи немного о себе. Чем ты
Would you
сейчас
talk to us a
занимаешься?
bit
Над какими
about
проектами
what you do now? What projects take your time?
Yeah, for sure. So for 2 years now, I'm working on my own. So I have my own one-man company. So I mostly work with PHP and Laravel these days, and I do freelancing, I do consulting, I do speak at conferences from time to time, like today. And yeah, everything related with PHP and business is what I do and what I share.
Расскажи, какой был твой путь к
Would you
Laravel?
talk to us
Это был
more
твой
about
первый
your
фреймворк?
path to
Как ты вообще
Laravel?
узнал
Was it your
о
first framework? How did you learn about it?
Yeah, so I started, I think it was about 9 years ago with CodeIgniter. So this was the first framework that I encountered, and yeah, it was very mind-opening for me because back in those days we just worked with PHP classes that you were searching on the internet, and then you copied some code and you hope everything was working. So there was like no composer, and the PHP ecosystem was very different. And CodeIgniter was a very cool framework to start with, but it wasn't that well maintained anymore. And then I switched the job, and then I had to take a look at new frameworks. And we were checking out at the time Symfony and Laravel. And we both agreed that we more liked the style of Laravel. And I think this is now 6 or 7 years ago. And now since then, I'm using Laravel, and I'm still very happy with it. And I'd like to share what I've learned in those last years.
Ты сегодня будешь рассказывать нам про
Will you be
исходники
talking to us today about the
фреймворка.
source
Как ты
code of
думаешь,
the
стоит ли
framework?
вообще
As you will be talking to us today
разработчику
about the source
погружаться
codes.
в
The question is,
данную
do you think the
фреймворк, изучать
developers
исходники?
should
И
actually
если
dive
стоит, то
into
когда?
sources?
Джуниору, медлу или
And
когда это
when
уже
should
сеньор?
the dev dive there? When he's a junior or middle or a senior?
That's a good question, and some of those I will also answer in the talk. But generally speaking, a framework is like a tool, and it's good if you can use it. So the most important thing is that you can work with it. But I'm pretty sure there comes a time when just working with it is not enough anymore because framework has some behavior, and sometimes it works like you think, but sometimes it doesn't. And this is when it makes sense to know more about the tools that you're working with and your framework as well. But I'm also going to cover this a little bit more in the talk itself. But it's important to know about something like a framework and also to dive into the core. But it's not the first thing that you want to do when starting a framework. So first you want to get familiar yourself with a tool, you want to be able to work with it, and then the next step, it doesn't matter if you're a junior or an expert, there comes a time when you have questions and then you want to answer them, and this is the time when you maybe start diving into the core of something like your PHP framework.
Thank you. Thanks indeed for your answers. And you have the floor. Let's listen to your presentation.
All right. Again, welcome everybody to my talk here, and thanks to the organizers and the conference for having me. It's a pleasure. I already watched some of the talks, especially the ones in English, because my Russian is not that good, but I'm trying so far. And today, you also heard a little bit about what I do. So my name is Christoph Rumpel. I'm a web developer from Austria in Vienna. And as I mentioned, I mostly work with PHP and Laravel these days, consulting, freelancing, but I also have my own little products like a book I wrote about ebooks or a video course I have about Laravel. If you want to know more about what I do, or just follow me on Twitter, this is my Twitter handle, Christoph Rumpel. I tweet a lot about PHP and Laravel, and this is where you can find me and reach out to me if you want to. Okay, now back to my talk. So the talk is called the Laravel Core Demystify the Beast. And I'm sure most of you know a little bit about Laravel. Probably some of you are using it, but if not, you probably heard of it. It's a very popular PHP framework these days. A lot of people use it. It's mostly known and loved because, yeah, it's very easy to start with. It provides nice and simple and good to read code and features, but it still provides a lot of flexibility and features in order to, provide you whatever you work on, from small projects to very big and complex projects. But when we talk about the nice syntax and some of the things Laravel is known for, there are a lot of things happening in the back to make this work. And this is why I think it's interesting to dive a little bit into the core of Laravel and see how this is actually working, because I find it quite interesting. And as I mentioned, it's very important to know about this stuff. So what I want to do today is I want to take you on a little journey where we're going to dive into 3 different parts of Laravel. So first, we're talking about the request lifecycle. Then we're going to check out Facades, which is a very highly discussed topic in and outside of the Laravel community. So this will be fun. And then we talk about Eloquent, which is the object relational mapper of Laravel to interact with the database. But before, we already talked about it a little bit in the introduction, but let's talk about this again in more detail. So why should you care about something of a framework? As I mentioned, a framework is a tool, and with most tools, we just want to use it. So right now I have this microphone, we're using some streaming technology, and to be honest, I don't have much information about how this works. I just use it in order to give you this talk today. And I'm fine with that. I don't need to more about it. And then of course it takes a lot of time to dive into something new, especially a framework is a very complex application. And let's be honest, it also can be overwhelming. So these are some common excuses why you wouldn't do this, wouldn't check out the core. But I also think there are some good reasons why you should care. So first, what I love about it, it speaks to you. So what I mean by this is when we take a look at, for example, a class that we use in our PHP applications from Laravel, then when I go to the core and check out this class tells me what it can do, what it can't do, what are the methods, what are the arguments. So it's like documentation, but in real. And this is what I really like about it. If I use a function, a method, and I don't know too much about it, you can go to documentation. That's okay as well, but of course not everything is documented. So when it's interesting to dive into the core and check it out yourself, especially with tools like PHP Storm, it's very easy to follow a function or a method and to see the actual code. Then the more about you know about your framework, you will better become at debugging. Because often we have some errors in our application, and the error says about something, this part of the application, but you were working on a different part, and now it's difficult to see how these things are connected together. And as I mentioned, framework is a very complex application, and this is why not all error messages are immediately easy to understand, but the more you know about the framework, the better you will become at understanding these errors, and especially about debugging in detail. Then always good to mention is framework, open source framework like Laravel Symfony. There are like 1,000 developers that worked on this project, and by looking at the code, we're actually looking at their solutions for very complex problems. So I think by checking out a code from a framework, we can only learn about PHP for ourselves. And in the end, I truly believe you will become a better developer and more efficient developer the more you know about the core. And I mentioned it's not the first thing that you would do, dive into the core of a framework, but there comes a time when you have more questions and when you're more interested in how things are working, and this is a good point to dive more into the core, and I can only tell you it will help you in the end. Okay, let's back to our journey, and we're going to start with the request lifecycle. So what is the request lifecycle? So it starts with the request that a browser sends to your application, to your server, to your Laravel application. Then we need to boot up the framework, load all the functionalities that we need. We need to handle the request, and we then need to send it back to the browser, a response that the browser can read. And this is what we refer to when we say request lifecycle. And of course, this is just a general overview, and we want to go a little bit into detail here. So the first entry point for every request in our Laravel application is the index.php file inside your public folder. And when you take a look at it, it's not that big, so it's a good idea to check this out today. And a few lines which are interesting. So the first line of code here is where we define a constant called Laravel start with the current time. And yeah, the funny thing about this first line in the framework that is being triggered by every request is that it is not being used in the entire framework. So you can't just delete it and your application would still work. Still, of course, this can be helpful if you use any packages that make some assumption about the performance, and then they will use this constant, to check the performance of your application, for example. So this is why it's still needed, and you probably shouldn't delete it, but you could. Okay, so here it gets interesting. We're first here requiring now the autoload PHP file from Composer. And yeah, before this point, our application has no idea about the PHP classes, where they are and how we can use them. But now with Composer and with the autoload file, we're actually able to use them. So this is very helpful. But it gets more interesting. Taylor Otwell, the creator of Laravel, said here in the comments, we're going to turn on the lights of our application, and this by requiring this application file. And what we get back here is our application instance. So there are a few things happening in the back, and some of them that are important to know. So we get sense of our application back, and in Laravel, this also serves as a dependency injection container. So this means every time you get something from the container, you will need to use this instance, and we'll also see this a little bit later. Then in the back, we're also going to bind the main kernels in Laravel. So in Laravel, we have the P kernel responsible for HTTP calls, and then we have the console kernel, which is responsible for your console commands. For us, for the request lifecycle, we're talking about an HTTP request. So the HTTP kernel is what we are interested in today. And then in the back, we're also registering the base providers. So you can see some base features of Laravel that we need very early in our application. So the base providers are responsible for logging, the event system, and the routing system. And we're also going to set the base path so that Laravel knows where it lives inside your application. Okay, now that we have our application instance and that we have the service container, we can already make use of it by calling this HTTP kernel class, and the container will give us back an instance of this HTTP kernel. And this is what we then already are going to use. So we're calling the handle method. Every kernel in Laravel, so the HTTP kernel and the console kernel, they only have one public method. That's the handle method. And you put in some data, and then you get back the response. And here what we put in as data is the request that came into our application. So this request has all information about the request that we need in order to handle it. And what the kernel gives us back is a response that we can send back to the browser. So we're doing here, and yeah, at this point we are already finished with the request lifecycle, to be honest. So I think it was like 7 or 8 lines of code. Here we're going to translate our response object to whatever we need. Probably it's HTML, or maybe it's some JSON data. That's what's happening here. But here we're sending back this to the browser. And yeah, this request lifecycle is something that happens with every request that comes in. It has to go through this file here, boot up the framework, handle the incoming request, and send back a response. The only thing left file is the terminate method on the kernel instance. And what this does is there are some things that need to be run after the request has already been sent back. And this could be, for example, some middlewares that ran. which are, for example, storing some data, session data. Okay, so yeah, as you can imagine, this wasn't much of code, but of course, a lot of things are happening behind this handle method of the kernel instance. So I don't have time to show you all of it, but there are two specific parts that I want to show you. And the first is a method from the kernel class, and it's called send request through the router. Yeah, what's happening here is first we're going to bind the request object that we get here, that we got from our index.php file. We're going to bind it to the service container. So this means every time we grab the request that we get a new instance with the fresh data that came in from this request. And then here we're going to clear our solved request facades. We're going to talk about facades a little bit later, but good to know is when you use a facade, the request facade, for example, it's being stored after the first time being called from the container. So the second time you don't have to load it again. But now we have a fresh HTTP request, so we need a fresh request, and this is why we're going to clear it out, so that next time we call it, we have a fresh request instance. And then also inside our class, we need to do some bootstrapping. And here, for example, we are loading the environment files. We are loading all the configuration files of the application. We're loading all the other service providers so that we can make use of all the other features that Laravel provides. But we're also talking here about the service provider that you create in your application or that comes from any packages that you use. And then at the end, we are making use of the pipeline pattern. And the pipeline pattern is a pattern in PHP or in programming where you have some kind of data and you send it through so-called pipes. And every pipe has the possibility to change the data or trigger something else depending on what's coming in. And what we are doing here is already a good example for the pipeline pattern because we are piping the request instance through the global middlewares. So in Laravel, we have some global middlewares which are responsible for emptying out empty strings to use to check for the trusted proxies, and we're also checking for the maintenance mode. So in Laravel, you can define the maintenance mode, and then, for example, this request would be handled different because then we wouldn't return any views or something. And to demonstrate this a little better, I have also this graphic here that shows you where we have those middlewares around our application. And when the request comes in, it needs to go through middlewares in order to get to the application. So we were talking about the global middlewares, but there are much more middlewares depending on the route that you use and what you have defined. But good to know is also on the way outside from application, the response also needs to go through some middlewares before the response is being set back. And these middlewares lie around the application, and it's a little bit like the layers of an onion. Okay, the second example that I wanted to show you about the request lifecycle is about the router. And here in this method, which is called dispatch to route, we can see two of the main tasks that the router is responsible for. So first, we're going to need to find the correct route. So in Laravel and any other framework, we need to define some routes and then to define what code is being called. And the incoming request has all the information to find the correct route. So like the URL that was called, the parameters, the HTTP verb, was it a GET request, was it a POST request, and so on. And in this method here, we're going to find the correct route, and then we're also going to need to run it. And in Laravel, you can bind the route to a controller, so then the code inside this controller method is being run, or you can also bind it to a closure, and then the content of the closure would be run. Nevertheless, how you do it, this code is being run and then it is translated to a response that the browser can read. And this is why it's then being sent back here. Okay, two of the examples that I wanted to show you about the request lifecycle. Just to remember, the index.php file is the main entry point. and it's a good idea just to check it out to see what's happening there. It's a very small file. And then the HTTP kernel and the router are very important parts of the request lifecycle in order to handle the request, find the correct route, and then send everything back to the browser. Okay, that was it for the request lifecycle. Let's move on to facades. Yeah, and as I mentioned, facades is a highly discussed topic, but yeah, when you hear about facades, you hear a lot of things like they are kind of magic, they are somehow proxies or maybe helpers, they use static interfaces, whatever that means, and they are somehow binded to the container. And you also hear things like they are misleading, hard to test, tightly coupled to the framework, and bad practice. And what we're going to do is we're going to check out what facades are, how they work, and then we come back here together and I give you my humble opinion about that. But it's a good idea to know about them before you make up your opinion. Our example for today is we have this conference endpoint and it comes with a parameter here. So let's say for the conference for 2020. And what we want to do is here get this year parameter from the URL, and you can do this with the request facade and Laravel. Of course, there are different other ways to do this, but this is a good example just to explain to you how a facade works. So I can already tell you, or you already know now, that we're using here the request facade. Okay, so when we want to check out how this is working, the first what we want to do is we want to see, okay, we're calling here static get method. Okay, let's check out our request facade class and check this get method here. Yeah, here you can see this is the request facade class, and it's a facade because it extends the base facade class, but we don't see any static get method here. The only method here defined is one called get facade accessor, where we return some string, but yeah, the method that we're actually calling is not here. Okay, so where else could it be? So probably inside our base facade. Okay, if we give our base facade a look, yeah, you won't find it there as well. But inside the base facade, there's a method defined called call static. And this is a magic PHP method which handles calls to static methods that do not exist. So our get method does not exist, and this is why this static and this magic PHP method is being called. And now here something interesting is happening, which is important to understand facades. We are now getting a new instance by calling the get facade root method. And here's the important concept of facades. When we're using a facade like the request facade class, we are actually not using this class, but a different class that is just connected to the facade. So this means when we go back here to our request facade, what Laravel checks is if we use this request facade, it checks for the service container for the key request, because the request is the key that we return here from the get facade accessor method. And this just means if you look in the container for the key request, you will find the correct instance that we actually want to use. And yeah, so this is how we get now our new instance, which is a different request class. We are then checking if it is given, and if it is, call the same method they get on this new instance again, but this time it's not a static method anymore. And then inside the other request class, it's the HTTP request class. Here we actually have this get method from the framework, and this is how we get back the parameter from the URL. So this is the actual instance that we are using. Okay, so going back here, when we use the request facade, we're actually using a different class. You can call it a service class, a helper class, and it's just connect through a facade class to it so that we can use in Laravel this very easy to use static syntax with this static get method that does not exist. Yeah, and now that we know a little bit more about how facades work, let's get back to how we can do the same without the facade. So for example, when we use a facade, we're actually, as I said, calling the application instance, which is the service container as well. And with this method here, we could do the same without using the facade. So this is basically the same. And now let's get back to the statements from before. So are facades misleading? Yeah, I would say they are, or at least could be, because it's not so easy to find out which class we are actually using. And if you don't notice, this can be misleading and can lead to misunderstandings. Are facades hard to test? You can already see that I disagree, but I come back to this in just a minute. They are for sure tightly coupled to the framework. You can only use them in Laravel, so that's true for sure. And then my favorite one, are they bad practice? So yeah, this is what you hear a lot when you read on Reddit and comments about, mostly from people that maybe don't know Laravel or facades that much. But yeah, when we think about facades, they are architecture decision about what you do. So it's not like we're storing data from a user that we not sanitize. This will definitely be a bad practice and a security issue. But using a facade is more like an architecture decision and a personal preference. So the one main thing or concern about facades are that we're not using dependency injection to use different classes. And this is a true argument. A lot of people like to use dependency injection, which is especially nice for testing, because then you can easily mock different dependencies. And this is true. But as we've seen a bit, you can test facades in different ways, which also makes sense. So most people that try to or want to use facades use it because they are very easy to read. It's not much code. You can easily change this code. And this is some of the opinions that people like about it and why I also like about it. For me personally, I use facades very often. And if there comes a point when I see, okay, this project gets a little bit more complex, I need a little bit of more structure, I need to spread out the dependencies, then I would also switch to dependency injection. But yeah, I normally only do this if I ran into any problems, and then I would change it. Okay, so back to the testing argument. So what most people don't know about facades is that we have some testing methods on it that we can use. So if you remember, facades are connected to a different instance that we're then using. So this means when we call the facade, we can actually also swap out the implementation. And this is what we do when we call the notification fake method. So we're swapping out the real implementation of the notification system in this case. So this is the notification facade with a dummy notification system, which we can use for a test like this. So in this test, we're going to test that we order shipping, and this would send out a notification. And now when we run this notification fake method on the first line, we are swapping out the implementation, the real implementation, with a dummy implementation. So it's like a mock. And now after we run the code, we can make some assertions on this new dummy notification. And one would be to assert that nothing was sent. So this could be a valid assertion, or we could just test if we send a specific notification to a specific user. And this is how we can make use of these helper methods for facades. And this is how we can actually very easily test them. And it's also some nice syntax to understand what's happening here very easily, because with mocks, it can also become quite complicated and not that easy to understand. So if you use facades, this is a good way to test them as well. Okay, so this was it about facades. Again, if you use Laravel, you can use Laravel without using facades. So this is working very good as well. So you can do this. So you don't have to use them. But if you use them, it's always good to understand how they work and how you can test them if you need to. Okay, now we move on to our last topic for today, which is Eloquent. So Eloquent is the ORM of Laravel, which stands for Object Relational Mapper. So this just means we are mapping the data from the database to objects in our application, so that it's for us much easier to work with this data in our object-oriented application. And Eloquent uses the active record pattern, so that's important to know. So the active record pattern is a pattern where our models are very tightly coupled to the database tables. So this means we have a model for every database table. So if we have a user table, we have a user model. If we have a conference table, we have a conference model. And these models store the data of the database inside themselves. But what's important here is they also know about the behavior and the logic in order to store, delete, or update them. So this all can be done with the same models. And this is where it's different from other patterns. And this is always important to understand when you use Eloquent. And yeah, so we're using models, and there's an Eloquent builder which handles a lot of the stuff in the back. Okay, but enough theory. Let's take a look at an example for today. So we have database with speakers table. We have a conferences table, and we have a many-to relationship between them. So we have an intermediate table called conference speaker. And we're going to use the example from before to get the year from the URL. And what we're then using is we're going to use the conference model to get speakers for a specific conference. So in this one last line here, a lot of things are happening. And we're going to start by splitting this all up in order to understand what's happening here and how this is working. In the end, we know we get speakers back. But how do we get those speakers? So the first call that we're doing here is, again, a static call to a where method. So the first place to look for this method would be, again, in the conference model. This is the conference model, so you can see that we have defined a relationship for the speakers, but you can see that we don't have any static where method inside here. So yeah, we're extending a base model, so maybe it's inside the base model. But yeah, like before, you also won't find this method in the base model, but there you will find this magic PHP method again, responsible for calls to static methods that do not exist. Okay, so this code is now being run, and what we're doing here is we're going to return a new instance of our conference model. So now we're creating the instance. Before we were just calling the static method, but now we're creating the instance, and now we're trying to call the same method with the same parameters, so the where method, on the conference model, but this time it's not a static method. Okay, but we've seen our conference model before. There's also no other where method, and this is why we're going to run in another magic PHP method, which is defined inside our base model as well. And this is the call magic PHP method, which is responsible for normal method calls that do not exist. Okay, in here we're first checking if it's incrementing and decrementing, because then it will be different. But if it's not, then we're going to forward this call to another instance. And this is also a pattern that you see in the Laravel Core quite often, that we forward a call to a different instance than the one that we are right in. And the new instance is what we get back here from this new query method. And this now gives us back a new instance of the Eloquent builder. So the Eloquent builder is very important for handling all the database requests. And yeah, we're moving the same method with the same parameters. We are now running on this Eloquent builder. And inside the Eloquent builder, we now find this where method we were actually calling. So instead of the static where method or conference model, we're actually calling this normal method on the Eloquent builder. And yeah, what this does, it stores inside the Eloquent builder this new where conditions. In our example, it would be something conference where the year is 2000. So this will now be stored, and we're going to return the instance of the Eloquent builder back. And this way we could chain more methods on it. So maybe we could chain another where method or use any of the other available methods. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So now that we get back here the Eloquent builder from the where method, we are now calling the first method on the Eloquent builder. And this translates to 3 different tasks. And it's also found inside the Eloquent builder through a trait called builds queries. And what we're doing here is we're first limiting our query to 1 result. So that's what the take method does. We only want to get back 1 result. And the take method also returns the Eloquent builder instance again. This is where we can another method on it which is get method. And the get method in the Eloquent builder is responsible for executing the query. So here we're actually calling our database and we get the data back. In Laravel, when we have multiple results, what you get back instead of an array is a collection instance. And a collection instance is just an object containing all the data of the response, and it just provides a lot of methods to run on the collection, which is very easy, like filtering or splitting it or any out of the array functions that you know. But it's a topic for another talk. We know we get a collection here, and now we're calling the first method on the collection. So this is now a different first method than the one that we see defined here. So this first method is now on the collection instance, and it just gives us back the first element of the data that is stored inside this collection. Okay, so now from the collection, we get back a new instance of the conference model, and this stores the data for the specific conference that we're searching. But we're not finished yet. We also want to get the speakers. Okay, it looks like we're calling the speakers property on the conference model, because this is what was returned from the first method. But as you've seen before, we don't have any property defined for speakers in our conference model. And when you think about it, it also would make sense to store it in the base model, because the base model has no idea about our relationships. This is why, again, another magic PHP method is being called from within the base model, which is called get, and which is responsible for property calls that do not exist. And yet now Laravel thinks it must be about an attribute. So an attribute is like the data from the database table. So for example, our conference table has a name field, an ID field. So these are the attributes of our conference model. If the key exists, we check now if the key exists inside the attributes. But when you think about it again, speakers, what we're looking for is not part of our conference model. We have a many-to relationship, so we have a different table for this. So this is why this call is not about attributes of the conference model. Laravel then if it's about a method that might exist with the same name, which is also not the case for us. And then at the bottom, Laravel thinks now, oh, okay, it's probably about a relationship. And it's now how Laravel loads the relationship from this specific model, and this is how we get back a collection of speakers here with this code. So just to sum this up again, we're using the conference model. We're calling the where method on the builder, the Eloquent builder. Then we get back a collection, and then we run the first method to get a conference model back. And on the conference model, we can use call a property like a relationship like a property. So when we call speakers, we would get back all the speakers, and the relationship is the one thing that we have defined in our model. Okay, so this is about how Eloquent works. Always when I talk about Eloquent and Laravel a little bit outside of the Laravel community, people ask me about, yeah, but what about Doctrine? Of course, I want to use Doctrine instead of Eloquent. And yeah, I get this. People love Doctrine as well, and you can also use it inside of Laravel. And there are a few packages out there, and this one, Laravel Doctrine, is the most famous one, which just helps you to use Doctrine inside a Laravel application, yeah, with migrations and all the features that you know from Laravel, just working with Doctrine. So if you're interested in this, yeah, check out this link. All right, so this was our little journey for today. We talked about the request lifecycle. Yeah, easy to remember. Index.php file is the main entry point. We were talking about facades. Yeah, make your own opinion if you want to use them or not. Both solutions have their pros and cons, so there's no right or wrong here, just personal preferences. And we were talking about Eloquent. I hope I could show you a little bit about how these things are working in the core inside of Laravel. In the end, it all comes down for me, and if there's one thing to take away for you is, yeah, you need to master your tools in order to become better. And your framework is one of them. If you use something every day, it makes sense to know as much as you can about it, and especially about your framework, because it will help you to become a better and more efficient developer. If you want to know more about the core of Laravel, I also have a video course called Laravel Core Adventures, where I teach about all the different parts of Laravel and how they work under the hood, like today, but with more topics. Many of them are for free, so just check them out. And if you're interested in all of them, you can also check out the pro version, where you give me a little bit of money and then you have access to all of them. Okay, here are some resources if you're interested in the resources for this talk. I hope you enjoyed this little journey into the core of Laravel. And thank you very much for listening, and I hope you're doing well.
Спасибо, Christoph, за доклад.
Okay.
Thank you, Christoph, for the presentation. We don't have much time, but I hope we will be able to cram a couple of questions here. So you work with Laravel for quite a lot of time, and it took us 40 minutes to understand it really good. But I think you found some things you don't like in Laravel, or some things that you miss or you would improve. Tell us more.
Thanks a lot. And of course, there are always things that you don't like about something that you use quite a lot. And with Laravel, for me, I still like the very easy and simple syntax, because it provides me a lot of readability, which is very important for me and the teams that I work with, that every developer that comes and see what's happening. And I think therefore readability is very good. But all the magic PHP thing used, it makes it very difficult to understand, especially for beginners. So what's really happening, what's really the class that we're using. And this is sometimes hard for a lot of people, and this is something that I don't like. So it comes with pros and cons. Also, what I see in Laravel, it provides a lot of flexibility. And for example, for many arguments, you can pass in a string, you can pass in an array, you can pass in a string with multiple values separated by any character, and this will also work. So it provides a lot of possibilities to do the same stuff, and I personally prefer more strict ways of defining. So I really like the new type system in PHP, the new features for that. So I like it more if it's more strict, because it leads to a behavior that is better to understand for me and easier to see when things go wrong. So this is something that I prefer differently, and maybe this will change in the future in Laravel as well, but I'm not sure.